Welcome to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisen, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And joining us from Dallas, Texas, is Stacy Winsett. And Stacy is the author of a brand new book called From Ashes to Influence: Leadership Forged by Fire and Faith. Stacy, do you have a copy of that book
I
that you
do.
want to hold
You
up
bet.
and that you can be very
Check
proud
this
of?
out.
There you go. That's her brand new book. And for all of my listeners, it's been a pleasure working with Stacy. Stacy, good day to you.
Good day.
Yeah, it's a beautiful morning, and I want to let our listeners know a little bit about you. She's a senior executive with 3 decades of experience leading people for some of the leading organizations such as RATP Dev, American Airlines, Gates, Trillium, and Herc Reynolds. She has sat in the chief people officer seat through mergers, turnarounds, national labor relations board hearings, and some of the hardest conversations a leadership team can have. Her peers describe her as a leader who brings uncommon clarity, steadiness under pressure, and a rare willingness to choose integrity over experience. In her book, From Ashes to Influence: Leadership Forged by Fire and Faith, Stacy traces the unseen path between childhood trauma and executive authority. She grew up in instability, abandoned, abused government housing and food stamps, and the kind of environment where she is a young girl to listen for footsteps and read a room before anyone speaks. Her book is a reckoning with the cost and a blueprint for what she calls stewardship leadership that no longer runs on survival but on integration, faith, and presence. It's the kind of book that speaks to anyone who learned to be strong too soon, who succeeded without ever feeling safe, and who is now asking the quieter question: what happens when survival works and when stop begins enough? Well, Stacy, I want to let our listeners know they can learn more about you at a beautiful website that she has called stacywinsett.com. There you can learn about the book. You can download a free chapter off of the book. So look to our link below in the show notes for that. You also can learn more about her speaking. There you're going to find a speaker's reel. You're also going to find her speaker's kit. And I would encourage you to go talk with Stacy because she's a wonderful hearted person and individual. So Stacy, let's kind of like dive in. Um, the opening and the origin of the book. For listeners who are meeting you for the first time, you spent decades as a chief people officer. So for a lot of those, it's in HR, senior executive, airlines, and so on, in manufacturing companies. But most executives at this level don't write a memoir like this one. What finally made you decide the story needed to be on the pages of a book and want to tell people a lot about your private life? Because that's, it takes lot of as Brene Brown says, a lot of vulnerability to do that.
Yes. She's one of my favorite authors, by the way. But for most of my life, my story was private. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't yet have a language for it. I wrote it after I truly understood the impact. I had spent decades in executive leadership environments where strength and composure and performance were expected. And I could do all that, but what I couldn't do, at least for a long time, was fully understand and integrate how the adversity I had lived through since childhood had really shaped me as a leader. And healing gave me the language for what it had shaped me as well as what it had cost. And my book is really asking a different question, not just what I survived, but what did it create in me as a leader and what did it cost? And so I wrote this book to help others recognize those patterns so that positive change can really happen in their life and in their leadership. And if just one person reads this and chooses safety, truth, or integrity sooner than I did, then it was really worth putting on the page and putting all that vulnerability out there.
Well, it's interesting because the title From Ashes to Influence, it's kind of so layered. It's a literally house fire opens up the book. But the fire is also a metaphor that runs all the way through the book. Talk with us about the opening scene and why you kind of decided to begin the story there.
So I'll tell you a little bit about the opening scene. My house is burning to the ground, and you can smell the fire and the wet. It was raining that day, and you can smell the wet wood, and you can hear the crackling of the wood. And I'm standing outside as my home is burning, and a literal fire wasn't just an event, it was an imprint on my life. Um, I'll leave you to read the book to understand just a little bit more about who caused that fire. I think that's really, interesting for you to read. There's a little bit about the mob in there and a little bit about arson, but it was an early moment in my life that I learned that stability can disappear without warning, and I learned that homes are not always permanent and walls don't always equal protection, and that's a big concept, right? I was 5 years old when this happened, and that wiring really followed me into adulthood and into leadership. So fire in the book is both literal and symbolic. It represents the destruction and ashes, yes, but also the refinement in me. I say in the book, "Fire didn't destroy me, it refined me." And so starting with
It
that
strengthened you.
right, it strengthened me,
At 5
probably
years
more so.
old to have that happen, I mean, it's gotta be it's like your whole world is turned upside down, but
Right.
to have an experience like that at that young of age is really got to be I mean, when you have the faith that you have, at the moment, maybe at 5 you didn't, but now as you look at it looking back as someone who's older, who's used this as a learning lesson, it's a huge learning lesson people to know impermanence. And I think impermanence is something, none of this stuff is permanent, right?
Right, right, you can overcome.
Yeah. So look, the other thing is that you write that you didn't grow up learning how to dream. You grew up listening for footsteps, for the shift in a tone that meant something was coming. For people who never had to develop that kind of hyper vigilance, what did that actually feel like day to day as a child? And when did you first realize it wasn't normal? So this is a real important point in this book.
We're digging deep here. Hypervigilant for me through childhood didn't feel like fear at the time. That's the part that most people misunderstand. It felt more like a super awareness, like constantly scanning for what might shift. As you said, the tone, the volume, the footsteps, energy in a room, and doing that 24/7. And it just became a part of who I was. That's all I knew from very early on in my life. That's all I knew. And so when that's your baseline, you don't question it. You think it's normal. I didn't realize till later, much later, that until I was really in environments of safety, that that wasn't normal and safety wasn't conditional. And I truly found that psychological safety.
Yeah, and that psychological safety as a young child is really, really important. And if you're not feeling that from a mother and a father and other people in the family, you're then beginning to build up these, I'm going to call them defense mechanisms.
Right.
Because for a better sense of word, that's what's happening. It's almost like you have to survive on your own, right? Um, and you say one of the most quietly devastating lines in the book is this: the safest thing you can be is useful. Well, that comes with the territory you were in. You had to be useful. And it shows because of your acceleration in the things that you've done in life after this. A lot of high performing adults, especially women, will recognize themselves in that sentence immediately. what did you do for somebody else? Not what did you do for you so much, but helping and serving. How did that belief form in you, and how did it eventually follow you into the workplace to make you the executive you that you are and the achiever that you are? Because when you live in a world where you're constantly achieving, Marshall Goldsmith says, well, you get to the top of the mountain and then you realize another mountain to climb. But
Right.
if you really have forged this, as your book says, you can look down in the valley and you can start to see there's other people that need help climbing to the top of the mountain. And you've been somebody that's done that. So, how did that belief help form you? And how did you eventually follow that into the workplace?
So I'll start off and say that what you'll find with people that have been through a lot of adversity, we always laugh in my family. They either go to drugs and alcohol or they
Right.
become a overachiever. So guess which route I chose. Um, but that belief in being useful, that keeps you safe. It forms when your value is really tied to what you can stabilize. And if you can anticipate needs, if you can keep things from escalating, you can carry more than your share, then maybe you stay safe, right? If you can fix it, if you can carry it, if you can anticipate it, you stay safe. And the challenge is that that same pattern gets rewarded in leadership, right? You're always the one people can count on, right? You're always the fixture. No matter what they bring your way, you can overcome, you can make it happen over and over and over to where guess what? It's all on your plate. And at some point, right, that starts costing you. Usefulness may have kept me safe many times as a child, but it made me over responsible as a leader, and it shows up as overperformance, over-functioning, taking responsibility that isn't mine or isn't ours, and for a long time, as I said, it gets rewarded, but people don't understand the cost inside. When you're still operating from survival mode and you've not learned how to regulate into stewardship, you're still operating with fear inside, and so, if your body's never shutting off, then your body's never healing, and so that's what makes it so hard to unlearn. You're always rewarded for being the strong one, and, nobody ever asks the cost.
I've once heard it said from Dr. Bierman. He's actually a wonderful, I'm going to say, colleague of mine. Uh, this fear and anxiety is the misuse of your imagination.
Oh, amen.
And, what did you do as a person who's elevated themselves in this? And for you speaking to all these women who are in these positions today, to advise them to redirect that energy from the fear and the anxiety into using their imagination for good. What did
Yeah,
you personally do? I know you found faith,
right.
obviously, which was a big one, and that's the one that helped you extinguish fear because you knew there was something greater in your life. What would you tell most women out there to do?
So first, I've lived it. I've crashed and burned so many times, so I can tell you from experience that I get it. I understand where you are, and I'm not saying that I don't ever get that fear. Every now and again, it will come in, and you feel that tightness in the chest. And now that I recognize what's going on, that's my immediate note to say step back and take a breath, right? Go take a walk around the house, whether and we work from home most of the time, or if you're on the road, go take a quick walk, right? For me, faith is a regulator, and so I'll go do a quick Bible study. I'll go say a quick prayer. I will just get my breathing, in rhythm, and realize that whatever's going on is not nearly as bad as I'm making it out to be that imaginary world that you're making it out to be. There's nothing, you've already overcome the worst. So what else is going to happen, right? So just take a breath, step back, and get some perspective.
I like your advice, especially the part about taking a breath and changing and shifting your perspective. Um, Now, you're very careful in the book to distinguish between resilience as a virtue and resilience as survival strategy. Can you unpack that for the listeners? Because I think a lot of leadership books celebrate resilience without ever asking where it came from. And in your case, you know exactly where this was forged. It was forged as a child. You had to be. And sometimes you have to let go. You have to be okay with who you are. And I know for somebody who's negotiated employee relations and been an HR director, the reality is most HR people, and we're speaking to all the women who are in HR and even the men, you know, their door is a revolving door with people coming in with problems all day long. They come to the mom and they expect the mom to solve the problem. What would you tell people that are in this position, and to say, "Hey, I'm distinguishing between resilience as a virtue and resilience as a survival strategy." It's like, no, close my door. You can't come in. It says, "Do not disturb Stacy Winsett today."
Right. And so resilience is not bad, right? We all want people to be resilient, especially in times of change. And as everyone knows, things are changing at a rapid pace today. But resilience wasn't a strength at first. It was, for me, it was a requirement, and it was built out of necessity. And the problem is when we celebrate resilience without asking what created it, sometimes resilience is just what happens when there's no other options, which is then being created by fear. So the danger is when we carry that into leadership without examining that, right? You look at people that are just highly resilient. You need to make sure that they're being checked, or they're checking themselves, but and you've got to understand what is driving that. Are they an overachiever, and are they one that's about to, to crash and burn and hit a wall, right? So because we started rewarding endurance instead of asking whether the environment itself is healthy, and that's important. We need to make sure that they're being healthy. If you've got someone that's working 24/7, 7 days a week, and they never stop and they never take a vacation, probably someone you wanna sit down and have a little chat with, 'cause
Yeah.
there's something driving that, beyond, and it could becoming unhealthy.
Well, I sometimes ask, what are people running from versus what are they running to? Frequently, there's a lot of pain in their life, and they're attempting to run away from something, versus run towards something real positive for themselves.
And I
And
would add to that executives, Harvard says that executives, that don't have boundaries are 2.6 times greater to burn out than anyone else. And that's really critical because, as executives, we're the ones that have to lead. And if we burn out, then, the rest of the team will follow.
well, self nurturing and care is a big thing, and self compassion is a big thing, and self love. And if you can't love yourself and you can't have compassion for yourself and your own mistakes, and you keep beating up on yourself that you've got to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, and that is not a place to be. So there's a chapter you call it "Why Smart Women Stay." Okay, and it's probably going to hit some of the listeners hard. You write that the question is not why start smart women stay, it's what trained them to endure. So, walk us through what you meant by that, and what do you want the women listening right now to understand about their own situation if they're in a role of executive position or leadership or middle management or wherever they might be?
Sure. And this one really applies to your personal life as well as your professional life, because there could be abuse going on in both domains. And I'm speaking about both of them here. I personally had gone through quite a bit of abuse in a marriage, and staying. It's not always about intelligence; it's about conditioning, and in many times it's about pride of why we stay. And if we've been conditioned to endure and to manage, or to minimize risk, sometimes staying is safer or feels safer. And I didn't stay because I didn't know any better. I was a strong woman. I was moving up the ranks in the airline. And so I didn't stay because I didn't know any better. I stayed because I knew how to endure. I knew how to fix things. I thought I could fix things. I'd overcome so much in the past. Why wouldn't I be able to fix this too? Right. And a big reason for me was, guess what? I didn't want to admit failure. My mother had been married so many times, which you'll read about in the book, And I was determined to not repeat those mistakes. And so, guess what? My pride got in the way of my safety. And that's the reality that many women are navigating quietly. We're always trying to be perfect, to your point. We're always trying to be perfect, and it's what they see on the outside. But I truly hope that this book can help you take the first step in choosing yourself and choosing safety, whether it's in your personal life or whether it's in a work environment where that's just not a fit for you and it's not healthy for you. I hope you'll choose yourself and choose safety.
And I think it's important that women know that's not selfish.
Right.
It's self-full, meaning it's for
Yeah.
them,
It's
and
critical.
you can't be any good to anybody else unless you're good to yourself. I mean, that's pretty simple stuff here, but the point is that's it. Now you reached a breaking point in the story.
Many.
The moment you finally left was not about what was happening to you. It was about your daughter. And you describe it as the most consequential leadership decision you ever made. Why do you frame leaving as a leadership act? And what do you want leaders to take from that framing?
Yeah. So, and I want to repeat that. Leaving that day was the most important and consequential leadership decision I've ever made. And I was deciding that day what I would no longer tolerate. I'd finally found the courage. I'd gotten to a limit. I was no longer going to tolerate abuse. And it was when my daughter's safety was at risk. That's when clarity replaced endurance and pride for me. And leaving wasn't always about escape. It was about responsibility. I had a responsibility to my daughter, and so I chose a different future for her as well as for myself. So leaving a bad environment, it's not always a excuse me, let me back up. Leaving a bad environment, it's a choice, right? It's a choice just like staying. There may be cost either way, but however, choosing yourself is always better, and it wins every time, right? Choosing your mental health wins every time.
Well, and the thing is, whether you're taking yourself out of harm's way, in this case, you leaving and taking your daughter, right? Or you're leaving a job because it's abusive, right? They are just treating you like you shouldn't be treated, and you understand that. And I think you have to go deep inside and listen to that calling, that intuition. You have to hear the voice that's speaking to you. And when you listen to it and you tune into it, it actually gives you advice on what to do. The key is being discerning and following that advice, following that calling. So you write that the body catalogs what the mind is still trying to explain, and that years later, your body started delivering a message your mind hadn't fully received yet. How did physical health enter into the leadership story? And what did you teach? What did it teach you about leadership that books hadn't at that point? You can read all these books, but frequently the messages we get, we have to integrate somehow.
Right. And as an over functioning adult, right, it's hard to stop and take a moment to recognize what's going on. That's the problem of the people that overfunction. You're never looking and taking care of yourself. You're always keeping all the balls in the air. And so the body always keeps a record. And for years I could perform through anything. I was always the accountable one, but eventually the body stops negotiating, right? And when your body never shuts off, as I said earlier, it can't heal, it can't regenerate itself. I had chronic illness my whole life, from tonsillitis, strep throat, ear infections as a kid, and then ultimately as an adult, that became autoimmune, right? And there's many, many things in between. Anyone that's worked with me and knows my story, they know what I've been through. But what the leadership books never taught me, though, is that endurance has limits. And it's not sustainable when you never shut off. And at some point, the cost becomes physical. You're going to see it. It's a matter of time. You're going to get sick more often. It's going to come out in your emotional state,
Mhm.
right? If you're in the wrong environment, you're going to be reacting emotionally, right? So pay attention to those triggers. And when you start seeing behaviors that aren't normal for you, that's a chance for you to step back and say, am I operating in fear? Am I in the right environment? Do I need to change something? because otherwise it's going to impact your health at some point. It's like your body tells you long before what your mind is still trying to negotiate, right? That's what I say. But you just have to listen to what your body is telling you.
Yeah, every one of your cells in your body are vibrating at a certain level. And when you put this intense amount of stress on you, whether it's coming from the home or the office or wherever it might be, the manifestation of dis-ease, dis-ease, I say dis-ease, okay, is really the element that starts to affect you, because the reality is it can manifest itself in that autoimmune disease, in that diabetes, in that heart disease, in whatever it might be. So, one of the central themes in the book is distinction between survival skills and leadership skills. You say survival skills don't need to disappear, they need to be repurposed with intention. What does repurposing actually look like in real leadership moments? And if you could give us an example of your own career when you repurposed these skills.
So I like to say, and I'll give you another version of what you just said. I like to say survival skills don't disappear. They just need a better assignment, right?
Okay. All right.
You just need to be reassigned somewhere else. Um, Early on in my career, I could always walk into a room and I could read it instantly, right? That came so natural for me, but that came from survival because I always had to read a room very, very quickly to stay out of harm's way. But maturity came when I really stopped reacting automatically and started to choose what emotions to take on and how to respond to that. So I'm an empath, and so one of the things about empaths is you absorb everybody's emotions of what's going on in the room, and you've got to learn to block some of that out, right? Because you've got your own emotions to tend to, and if you're again, it's a matter of being over functioning and constantly being on. So what used to be hypervigilance needs to become discernment, right? Instead of constantly waiting for the next ball to drop, take a step back and have some discernment about what's going on. Let's look at the facts of what you're dealing with, and let's look at this give it perspective. And what used to be over functioning needs to become intentional leadership. So again, regulate yourself. Start to don't work 24/7. You've got to take that self-care. You've got to take care of yourself so that you're not over functioning. Because if you're over functioning, you're not going to be able to take the time to really look at strategy and be forward thinking. You're still looking in the past trying to make sure balls don't drop. So the difference really is choice, right? Choose intentional leadership and stewardship instead of, staying in that survival mode.
Well, and you say that so articulately. I think, look through the front of the glass of your car
Right,
versus the rear view mirror, right? And I think frequently we've been trained to look what's coming from behind us because we're in fear mode. If you're in full flow mode, meaning going toward it, if you're in flow, for those of you who've been in flow, it's like all time disappears. Everything kind of disappears, and you go into an altered state of consciousness, right? And it's like this really cool state. But because we're being thrown in this world today with AI and all this stuff
right,
that comes after us so quickly, it kind of has a tendency to have the rear view mirror, like, you're like
right.
looking behind you because there's all this stuff. And for us to sit quietly with faith, and that's where this book actually takes a turn. Your faith runs quietly throughout the entire book, and you make a real striking distinction. You say fear based faith asks for compliance, but trust based faith allows agency. I always said ego is edging God out.
Yeah,
Okay. There's a little t and there's a big T. The big truth is it's a knowing. Okay. And there's a difference between a knowing and a belief. Okay. So I want to make that distinction. But trust based faith allows agency. That's the big T. How did your understanding of faith mature as you healed, and how does it now show up in how you lead people?
sure. So early on, my faith was really tied up in more in survival, right? It was just, God help me through this, right?
Right, right,
Yes, get me out of this.
right.
And now it's all about trust. There's one story in the book where I literally just put my faith out there. I left a job that was not healthy for me. I had a house to sell there. I literally came back to Texas, bought a home here immediately. So I had 2 homes, literally no job, and said, "You know what? I have faith. God's going to take care of me." And it wasn't a week later, I get a call from an old boss that's heard I was back in Texas. He says, "Oh my gosh, I've got, I've got work for you. I need you to come consult for me." And so I got rewarded for that faith. And I just knew, I was like, I've done all the wrong things, right? And the little t. And I just knew that I was going to get rewarded for obedience, and I finally just stepped out in faith, and I've done that ever since. It's all about that trust. As you said, fear-based faith asks you to comply, whereas truth-based faith allows you to. Let me say that again. Trust-based faith, that's a lot of words, allows you to choose, and that mind shift really changed how I lead. I can now lead with discernment, with restraint, and with a deep sense of responsibility for how I influence the people I lead because I've been through it,
Mhm.
right? I've made all the mistakes for you, so just trust me on this one. If you take anything from this book, it's take a step for you, right? Just have that faith in whatever your regulator is, whether it's faith or any other regulator. Find a way to regulate yourself. Again, faith is what does it for me, and you'll see that throughout the book.
Well, and I think I'm gonna quote something around, Rita McGrath, who wrote about a book called Seeing Around Corners. And I think when you're going in trust-based faith, you can see something coming at you and you can plan a strategy, especially as a leader, right? Because you are kind of being able to kind of predict things with this faith, to see things that are in front of you. And that's important. And I think the person you speak about in the book, your husband, Lewis, uh, in a way, he became the tender person, really the most person that allowed you to give your nervous system permission to rest. For a leader who's been strong all their entire life, that's you, Stacy Winsett. What does it take to actually receive that kind of safety from another person and be willing to truly 100% accept his compassion, his love, his understanding, and his heart to allow you to just rest?
Yeah, boy, we are going deep, aren't we?
Yeah.
Uh, so getting the body to rest really has been one of the hardest things for me to overcome, and it still is. We'll never always be on the other side. There's always going to be times that draw me back in. Ergo, the whole chapter about the cost of overfunctioning in the book. Um, but when you've been the strong one your entire life, safety feels unfamiliar and it feels suspicious, right? Too many times, perceived safety has come back to bite me. Right? I've put my faith out there and got it slapped, and so with Lewis, my nervous system had to learn something new, and that calm doesn't always mean something bad is coming next, and neither does an occasional raised voice. I would brace, and it would frustrate him. I would brace anytime we used to have an argument, because maybe that voice would get raised and then I would immediately brace and until I realized that I was in a safe space. And every marriage is going to have arguments and sometimes voices get raised. And so it was what happened after where I had that safe place to fall. And so learning to receive safety meant breaking down the walls. And that was really a process. It took time. It took an environment again back to that psychological safety to get me there.
Well, and I
That
mean, look, somebody who's worked in executive, gone through this divorce, pulled your daughter away, lived this life kind of by yourself a while, allowed another person back in again. It takes a lot of trust, right? and it takes time for you to build that trust, no matter how long you're dating before you actually, go to walk down the aisle. But in part four, you introduce this concept of stewardship as the mature expression of power. For leaders listening who are also formed in hard environments, who know that they run on vigilance and overfunctioning, what's the first practical shift that you'd ask them to make tomorrow morning when they wake up? Because they're the hard drivers, they're the type A personalities, they're the ones that get shit done, they're the one that everybody expects to do the next best thing. They're the ones that are supposed to do the strategic plan and help everybody through it. Yet at the same time, they're tired. They're exhausted. They're like, I can't take this anymore. What are you going to tell them, Stacy?
Oh my goodness, this was a lesson I had to learn the hard way. I'm a DI personality on the disc scale, and right, so I'm a driver that likes to have fun, but
Uh,
that driver is usually in charge. But you have to understand that your presence leads before your title. Right? You can be, at the top of the ranks from as an executive, but it's your presence that leads. However you show up in that room is what leads before the title. So you have to pay attention to your own nervous system before you try to manage anyone else's. So as the flight attendant says, put on your own oxygen mask before you help others, right? And that's so true. And so when you feel that anxiety in your chest, that again, as I said before, it's your clue. You've got to step back, take a breath. Don't don't let that version of yourself show up with your teams, because that just gives them anxiety over and over. You've worked with leaders that that they're always afraid that, that their boss is gonna come down and crack heads, if you will, and you've gotta be the one that stops that, right? You stop that anxiety from coming down, and it's all how you choose to set that tone, not just through decisions, but through your presence. And if you walk into every room with that urgency, again, your team's gonna feel it,
yeah.
even if nothing's wrong.
Well, you and I have walked into companies where you could cut the air. I call it cutting the air
Right.
because the tension that exists in there, that's not a good culture to work in. It's also not a productive culture. It's also not a culture that's going to produce the greatest productivity from its people or engagement. And it's like you just said, if somebody's waiting for the axe to drop the next minute, they're literally in fear most of the time. They don't feel safe. I just had 2 weeks ago or so Gary Ridge on here. The CEO was the CEO of WD-40. And he said one of the things that when they did the story about the company and he did a survey, that he found that most people basically said is during COVID, they felt safe at WD-40. They felt safe. And I thought that was really interesting. He said it was like a moment in his career as a CEO taking a company to $3.5 billion that during this time of change, uncertainty, whatever, people felt safe. And I think that's a really big thing. And you say that leaders tolerate that leaders tolerate what they tolerate becomes culture, and that silence is never neutral. That's a big claim, and it's a real implication for executives on boards. Where do you see this playing out most in today's workplaces? And what's the cost when leaders get this wrong?
Oh my goodness. So silence protects the status quo. What leaders tolerate becomes culture, right? Even when it's not intended. Um, And I see this most in environments where high performers are allowed to operate without accountability and boundaries. And this leads to bad behavior generally. And with a leader that's already unhealthy, it can create unsafe environments. So when you're only focused on the what and not the how, or the bottom line and not the how that you got there, it can be devastating. The cost is trust with your organization, psychological safety for your employees, and once that erodes, culture is sure to follow. It's just a matter of time.
So true. And it is something that when we're speaking here, the reason people get coaches, go to psychologists, try and work on themselves, the higher degree, and I hate to use this word, but emotional intelligence that one can have to really, and I think there's also a spiritual intelligence. There's a lady who actually talks about companies having a spiritual intelligence. And I remember early on, I went to conferences where it was called spirituality in business. And the reality is, if you can't bring that to business, if you can't bring that with you, okay, into your work life, it's a challenge, right? You need to know that there's a power greater than you working in your behalf all the time. And I say this with a big fervor because it's very, very important. So, Stacy, your book concludes with certainty, but with what doesn't conclude with certainty, but what you call capacity. The capacity to notice yourself, to choose differently, to return when you forgot. If someone finishes this book and takes one thing away into their life and leadership, what do you hope it is? And where can our listeners basically find you? We know we can get you on stacywinsett.com. You're going to see it in the show notes below. You're there for anybody who's listening to this podcast. Send her an inbox email. Find her on LinkedIn. We'll have the LinkedIn below so you can connect with her there. Go to Amazon and get the book. We have a link to Amazon so that you can pick up a copy of this book. But really, I think what is the one big message you would like individuals and leaders, because we're both, to take away?
All right. Survival may have shaped you, but it doesn't have to define you or how you lead. That's probably the most important. You can choose differently. You can build something healthier for yourself, for your people, the people you're responsible for. You have more choice than you think. And so I say, survival may have shaped me, but it doesn't get to lead me any longer. And it doesn't get to lead you either. So make the choice.
So just make the choice. Okay. So for all of my listeners, you want to hold that book up again, please? I've got it over here, but mine has a big line across it. Oh, so
Mine
does
does too.
yours.
I know,
Okay. All
I have one
right.
over here in the other chair.
Okay. So it's From Ashes to Influence with Stacy Winsett. She's been with us today. Stacy, thank you for sharing your time, your wisdom, your knowledge, and your truth about what it takes to transitions oneself into nurturing who they can really become, and especially when it has to do with working inside the company, meaning bringing this essence, like you who has negotiated labor relations in really tense environments. You have to, at your core level, have a huge trust in what's going to go on. You have to be certain about you call it your capacity, but your ability to guide and direct and get the job done. And I think that's really important. And much of that comes from your faith that's been
100%.
forged, that ahead of time. There are a lot of my listeners who do affirmations. Well, if you're going to go into labor negotiations ahead of time, or you got a tough thing that you have to negotiate with an employee, definitely do your affirmations before you walk into that, because that's what you do. There you go.
There
She's
you go.
got
There's my Bible study on my desk. I don't have.
with her affirmations that I'm sure she reads all the time.
Right.
Honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much for being on the show. Blessings to you. And for all of my listeners, please go out and get a copy of Stacy's book.
Thanks, everyone.